Lecture Series this year is on the North End. The Paul Revere House, so much of its meaning comes from its place in the North End, both before Revere's time and after Revere's time. So I'm really pleased that we're going to look at that and explore some of the interesting folks who lived in the North End. And I'm also honored to have our good friend John Tyler here to kick us off. And with that, I'll turn to Robert, who's going to introduce the series. So enjoy the lecture.
Great, thanks, Tina. Welcome, everyone, both in person and virtually. We're really glad for you to be here in any capacity. As Nina said, my name is Robert Schemp. I'm the Research and Adult Program Director here for the Paul Revere Memorial Association. So as Nina alluded to, I mean, this is really something we've been thinking about for the past year and a half, really, for planning, as everything has been convoluted planning-wise, of course, over the last 18 months or so. We knew that this place-based element was going to be really important and something that we wanted to center on for the lecture series this year. You know, after a year of separation, we're certainly really looking forward to hosting the lecture series, at least being able to have the lecture in person. We're so grateful for all of you here tonight, and certainly for all of you watching, but it was really important for us to be able to do this in the North End and here, specifically for this lecture at the Paul Revere House. Additionally, as Nina was saying, we thought we'd turn the scope onto the North End specifically. So with this lecture series, and certainly we've seen some of this, and maybe you've seen some of this in the marketing that we've done, but we have three distinct individuals that we're looking at this year. Certainly Thomas Hutchinson with this lecture, Prince Hall with lecture 2, and Pauline Agassiz Shaw with lecture 3. Three different characters with ties to the North End over a couple of distinct periods in history. As we get started, I do want to thank, of course, the Lowell Institute for making this lecture series possible. And of course, a major thank you to all of our local joint sponsors. A big thank you, of course, to Annie, WGBH, and the Forum Network, certainly the Colonial Society of Massachusetts as well, Old North Church, and the North Bennett Street School. So for tonight's lecture, we are absolutely thrilled to have John Tyler from the Colonial Society of Massachusetts here to present on Thomas Hutchinson and the raid on Hutchinson's house following during the Stamp Act riots of 1765. I think one of the things that always stands out to visitors here at the Paul Revere House is that Hutchinson's mansion, maybe a strong-armed baseball throw, but in some ways about a baseball throw away from the Paul Revere House, or at least where that mansion stood. So I think visitors are always surprised of the proximity for Hutchinson to Paul Revere in this revolutionary period. Of course, two individuals, two different houses, and two individuals that ended up with very different loyalties and legacies during the American Revolution. So just for a few housekeeping items before I formally introduce John. After the lecture, we are going to have plenty of time for question and answer if you'd like. So for those of you in-house here, feel free to raise your hand. I'll moderate here for John. Absolutely can get to your questions in-house here. If you're watching from home, our education director, Emily Holmes, is monitoring all the streams if you're watching on GBH's YouTube, Facebook, on our links as well. So feel free to submit your questions in whatever a stream format, chat format you have available. Emily's going to monitor those. I'm going to have my computer up and feed up as well. So feel free to send those in. I'll monitor those, and we'll try to get to everybody's questions as time allows after the lecture. If you are watching at home, just as a heads up, if you're watching at home, the broadcast doesn't really work for slides in the moment, so you won't be able to see the slides as the lecture is going on, but the slides absolutely will be edited in after the fact for any viewing you want to have on GBH's streams, our streams, and wherever the lecture will live on the internet. So those will absolutely be coming into play after the lecture is recorded. So with that, let me formally introduce tonight's speaker, John W. Tyler. John's talk tonight is entitled "Such Ruins Were Never Seen in America, the Looting of Thomas Hutchinson's House During the Stamp Act Riots." John is a longtime editor of publications for the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. More specifically, for tonight, he's the editor for the Correspondence of Thomas Hutchinson, which is phenomenal, and recently, this year, 2021, published Volume 3, which covered the period of Hutchinson's response to the Boston Massacre and its aftermath. Volume 4 is in the works, which is going to take us through through 1770, up through June of 1772, doing a fantastic job at hitting these 250th anniversaries. Previously, John held a 36-year-long career teaching history at Groton School. He's the author of Smugglers and Patriots, Boston Merchants, The Advent of the American Revolution, and a number of scholarly articles and reviews. He received his PhD at Princeton. So with that, we're welcoming John, and I'll hand things over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. And if we can go ahead to put on the first slide. Thank you very much to the Paul Revere Memorial Association for this invitation to speak this evening. It's safe to say that Paul Revere would have cordially hated Thomas Hutchinson, even though he was a near neighbor. But
So we might just need to close that here, John, for a second.
okay.
Open. If you can just escape real quick.
There we go. Good. Hutchinson was a native-born Massachusetts citizen, but he was the royal governor at the time of the Stamp Act, or time of the Boston Massacre, and also the Boston Tea Party. And by the time that he left Massachusetts for good in June 1774, it's safe to say that he was among the most hated men in Massachusetts. Here on the opening slide, you see the 19th century image of the looting of his house on the night of August 26th, 1765. It was a, I think this engraving has contributed to a misapprehension that people burned Hutchinson's house, but even after consuming all the contents of Hutchinson's wine cellar, which they did, they would not have set fire to a building in the midst of a wooden town like Massachusetts, like Boston at the time. If there are just 2 points to take away from our conversation this evening, I would say, one, I hope this evening makes you aware of the shocking violence of this event. Our folklore about the American Revolution has softened our perceptions of what the sort of things were happening, so that much of the violence involved in these riots was directed at persons. It was deeply personal, of the sort of, we know where your children are, and we'll find them. And at some points, like tarring and feathering, really amounts to torture. So this is, were troubling times. And there was probably, I think it's probably safe to say that August 26, 1765 was amongst the most violent moments in the history of the North End. This is a pivotal event in the history of the American Revolution. It's easy to draw a very direct line between the Stamp Act riots in 1765 and Lexington and Concord. And it wasn't the first riot of the 14th of August that set things off in this direction. It was really this riot on the 26th, and you can chart the speed at which news moved down the Atlantic seaboard by noting when similar outbreaks of violence took place in Newport, Rhode Island, and New York, and Philadelphia, and beyond. So this is an event with a long tail of consequences. Hutchinson wasn't always the most hated man in Massachusetts or the colonies. In fact, up until about 1760, he was probably one of the most admired men in Massachusetts. This shows him on a trip to England in 1741, sort of at the beginning of his career. It's the only image that we have of him that was done from life. So this is the authentic image of the man. He made enough money as a merchant very early in life, in his 20s, to essentially dedicate the rest of his life to public service. He was a selectman of the town of Boston. For 10 years, he was one of the 4 representatives from Boston to the General Court. He served as Speaker of the House of Representatives for 3 of those years. He was for 16 years on the Governor's Council, or upper house of the government. He was a judge of probate for Suffolk County. He was Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts and Chief Justice. One of the things that's sometimes said about Hutchinson was that he was an accumulator of offices, and the implication is that he's a corrupt figure. I'd just like to read into the record that there was very little money involved in any of these offices until he became royal governor in his own right, that there was virtually nothing involved with lieutenant governor, and being chief justice, all the justices of the Superior Court generally complained that it cost them more to serve as justices traveling to all the various parts of Massachusetts than they were paid. Hutchinson had a reputation for keen logic. He was a writer of clear, cogent, persuasive prose. He was often called upon for negotiations with other colonies. He represented Massachusetts at the Albany Conference, which was a discussion of abortive plan of intercolonial union. And he was often called to draft petitions for the province of Massachusetts. The General Court turned to him at the time of the Stamp Act to help draft that petition, and Hutchinson thought the tone was too angry, and he tempered the language of the petition. And because of that, he had a reputation as being a secret favorer of the Stamp Act. It's not true. He had opposed it and regretted the passage of the legislation, but once it was law, he felt it was his duty to help enforce it. Here's a familiar image, the Burgess map of Boston in the 18th century. Those of you recognize the North End here at the very tip of the peninsula. It was among the first settled areas of Boston. But by 1765, it was an area in decline. It was populated mostly with Boston's seafaring population and the sort of allied trades related to that. To locate you even more precisely, here's a detail of the map, and we are all standing here on North Square. This building is what they would have called Old North Church, no longer exists, and you'll see up here Christ Church, which we now call Old North Church. Hutchinson's house was on Garden Court Street here. So it really was, as Robert was saying, just a hefty softball throw down the street. And many of the objects I'm going to be showing you this evening probably were strewn about the street just out here on that evening. But despite the fact that it was a neighborhood in decline, there were still very grand mansions from some of the original families still standing. And you get a sense of that from this perspective view of the town of Boston. This is the steeple of Old North, and this Christ Church, what we call Old North. And here is Hutchinson's house here, sort of lording it over the rest of the houses in the neighborhood. This is perhaps the best image we have of what the house looked like. It was built sometime between 1689 and 1692. It was demolished in 1933. This illustration comes from something called the American Magazine of Useful and Entertaining Knowledge, which is, I think, if it were still in operation, it would be a magazine I would enjoy subscribing to. Some aspects of the engraving are questionable. It doesn't show the so-called lanthorn, which we'll be hearing about, or cupola, we would call it, which would have stood above the center of the house here as a focal point in the roof line. It's possible that that was not rebuilt after the riot, and this shows the house after it was restored after the riot. But certainly some things seem to be quite accurate. You see on these full-length pilasters on the sides of the house, oops, sorry. The historic New England has in its basement this capital for one of the pilasters. So that does correspond quite well with the engraving. Now, who was living in the house? As in many colonial structures, there are quite a few people living in one residence. Here they are 12. There's Hutchinson himself, age 54 at the time. His two sons, Thomas Jr. and Elijah, 25 and 22. He has one a daughter of a marriageable age, Sarah Hutchinson, age 21, and two younger children, William Sanford, 13, and Margaret, 11. But more interesting in a way are the other people living in the house. His sister-in-law, Grizel Sanford, age 45, was also living in the house. Hutchinson had married the great-granddaughter of Governor Peleg Sanford of Rhode Island. The two families had very close mercantile connections. Hutchinson married Margaret, the second daughter. Andrew Oliver, whose name you may recognize as Secretary of the Province, married the eldest daughter. And so at that point, the Olivers joined this conglomerate of the Hutchinsons and Sanfords, really three important merchant families in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. Grizel was the third and youngest sister. She never married, and she came to live with Hutchinson and care for his young children after Hutchinson's wife died in 1754. He never remarried. As you'll see when we get to talking about her wardrobe later, she was a rather grand lady. Other people in the house are the housekeeper, a maid, a coachman, Mark, who is simply designated as Mark, a Negro. Whether that means Mark is a slave or not is uncertain. Some people see the use of the word Negro in the 18th century as a sort of code word for slave. But we don't have an inventory of Hutchinson's property other than the one we're talking about this evening, and so he's not listed as a slave. So you can believe whatever you choose on that subject. Curiously enough is Mrs. Walker, a widow who he seems to have taken in out of charity, and we'll talk about her a little later as well. Here is Hutchinson's account of the night of the riot, which he's writing about 4 days after the event. In the evening, whilst I was at supper and my children round me, somebody ran in and said the mob were coming. I directed my children to fly to a secure place and shut up my house, as I had done before, intending not to quit it. But my eldest daughter repented her leaving me and hastened back and protested she would not quit the house unless I did. I could not stand against this and withdrew with her to a neighboring house, where I had been but a few minutes before the hellish crew fell upon my house with the rage of devils. In a moment, with axes, split down the door and entered. My son, being in the great entry, heard them cry, "Damn him, he's upstairs, we'll have him." Some ran immediately as high as the top of the house. Others filled the rooms below and cellars, and others remained without the house to be employed there. Messages soon came one after another to the house where I was to inform me that the mob were coming in pursuit. And I was obliged to retire through yards and gardens to a house more remote, where I remained until 4 o'clock, by which time one of the best finished houses in the province had nothing remaining but the bare walls and floors. Not contented with tearing off all the wainscot, the paneling inside the house, and the hangings, and splitting the doors to pieces, they beat down the partition walls between the rooms. And although that alone cost them near 2 hours, they cut down the cupola or lanthorn, and they began to take the slate and boards off the roof, and were prevented only by the approaching daylight from a total demolition of the building. The garden fence was laid flat, all my trees, etc., broke down to the ground. Such ruins were never seen in America, besides my plate, meaning his silver plate. Besides my plate and my family pictures, household furniture of every kind, my own and my children and servants' apparel, they carried off about 900 pounds sterling in money and emptied the house of everything whatsoever except a part of the kitchen furniture, not leaving a single book or paper in it, and have scattered or destroyed all the manuscripts and other papers I had been collecting for 30 years together. He was writing a history of the province of Massachusetts, had a number of important historical manuscripts in his possession, and besides a great number of public papers, which may have been one of the causes of the destruction of the house. Okay, what did the interior of the house look like? Well, we're guessing here, and as I've chosen to represent it from the description, I'll now be referring for evidence mostly to an inventory that he submitted to the Crown to be reimbursed for his losses during the riot. And from we can really reconstruct the house and the way it was furnished from that inventory. So a central hallway, central stairway and hall, not unusual in an 18th century house. Some of the language may be a little unfamiliar to a modern audience. When he refers to the hall, it's kind of an old-fashioned word for him to use at this time. In the 17th century, a hall would have been the place where the family gathered, where they ate, where they cooked, and the parlor, which you see opposite the entry here, would have been reserved for entertaining only the most important guests. By Hutchinson's time, it's very clear from the inventory that the hall is functioning mainly as a dining room in the house. And then you'll see a little room, which we'll talk about later. And then one of the conjectural things here is a room called the closet. Now, it's clear from the inventory that the closet had a fireplace in it. So it's not just a storage closet as we think of it. I think the term here means more a sort of private study. And confirming that interpretation, we also have a description of Hutchinson's mother going to the closet to pray. Well, she wouldn't go literally into what we would think of as a closet to pray. So she's in this small room to do her meditation and prayers. Upstairs, in what they call the chamber, or what we would call bedrooms, the chamber floor, there is a room called the Great Chamber, directly above the parlor, a room called the Hall Chamber, above the hall. And Hutchinson lives in something called my lodging chamber, and then there's a back chamber. There's also a third floor to the house, which I've chosen not to represent. We know very little about that, except that his two sons lived on the third floor and probably some of the servants. Now, a note about the contents of the house. When we walk into a restored 18th century house, we admire the very grand furniture, like this secretary desk, what Hutchinson would have called a walnut desk and shelves. Well, in the late 20th century, when the prices of brown furniture were stronger than they are now, a oil-producing family from Texas paid $11 million for this piece of furniture. Note that Hutchinson values it at £7. Oops. Go back. Now, the key here is that the textiles in the house are the most important things in the house, not the furniture. And Hutchinson values the bed hangings in the house at £50. So in other words, 7 times the amount of that secretary that we were just looking at. Now, when I say that it was valued £50, this is in the great chamber where there's also fabric on the walls and on a matching set of red damask chairs. But nevertheless, bed hangings like these that you see on the bed here, probably a value of 20 or 25 pounds. So the great value that was destroyed this evening was not furniture so much as it was textiles stolen or destroyed. Now, a word about the arrangement of furniture in the house. There is to our minds, an extraordinary number of chairs in the house. There are 60 overall. And they are here, the key to understanding this is that in the 18th century, furniture was arranged around the edges of the room, and then servants would bring it to the center and arrange it as needed for dining or for tea or for conversation. So all this furniture that we talk about is generally pushed back against the walls and then brought out to the center for use. Now, a word about these chairs. A number of the chairs are cane chairs, which is more 17th century. You see this William and Mary cane chair here, and more contemporary. This would have been more a la mode in 1765 than the cane chairs. So I think when you think of Hutchinson's house, grand but a little old-fashioned, grand but somewhat dowdy, I think is probably the way to understand it. Now, examining the value of the furniture in the various rooms. Well, as you would expect, the parlor, the room for grand entertaining, leads at £131. But not very far behind is the great chamber. Now remember, that's upstairs. It's the room above the parlor. It's a bedroom, and we'll get to that in a moment. But keep in mind that it's very close in the value of its furnishings to the parlor itself. The hall and the buffet, less, then you go on and on and on into smaller amounts. Note the relatively low value of the furniture in his own chamber versus, say, the hall chamber or the great chamber. Other relative expenses. Note the value of the wine cellar, £164. That's the wine in the cellar was worth more than the furnishings in the parlor. Articles not appropriated to any room, there are £138, but £80 of that is beds, meaning mattresses. So again, that's the value of it. Silver plate, only £64. It's a bit of a puzzle. Some people think a house like this would have had more silver plate. It's hard to say. Books, it's also puzzling that he only asked for £50 reimbursement there because he was reputed to have one of the best libraries in the province, and it was all dispersed on that evening. Note how much cash there is in the house, £760 of cash. There's a lot of money. This is a world without banks. Now, what's in the parlor? Well, you can see various things here. A tea table and burnt china tea set. I'll explain that in a moment. 12 walnut chairs, large walnut table, a bed and pillar for the couch, and dozens of cushions. We'll explain that as well. 2 large family pictures, smaller pictures of his grandfather and mother, 4 large prints, newly framed and glazed, covered with glass. Shovel, andirons, tongs, large turkey carpet. Okay, what's burnt china? Well, it is china with a couple overlays of glaze. Some people would say it's just this, could be this sort of thing. Others say it's a term that's specifically reserved for this, what's called Batavia ware, where there's a brown underglaze and then there's more glazes, different glazes on top. But that's what the tea set looked like. Now, what's this bed, this couch with a bed and pillar for the couch? It probably means a day bed, a wooden frame on which an upholstered bed is spread. There are also pillows in there as well. Note that the couch, the wooden frame, is only worth 3 pounds. The pillar in the couch is worth 14 pounds. Turkey carpet, 8. In the closet, now remember this is probably a room, but it does seem to be somewhat for storage. There are china plates, knives, etc., blue and white tea set, decanters, but we also see 2 glass sconces at the sides of the mantelpiece. So there's a fireplace in this room. The entry. Well, if you came in the front door, what would you see? There would be a dozen very good cane chairs, a large walnut table, and 2 hanging lanterns. This is where, if you had business with Hutchinson, you sat in the hallway while you waited to be called in to see the great man. In the hall, now this is the room opposite the parlor, 2 large sconces with arms, coats of arm, with arms for candles going out, square mahogany tables, which would have been joined together as needed, depending on the size of the gathering. Painted oilcloths for the floor, easier to clean than carpet. 7 glazed prints. Then he has a collection of 5 large busts on the mantel, which is kind of interesting as well, and a Dutch tea kettle and stand. Now, the busts on the mantelpiece, when he was replacing things that were missing, his son was in London, Thomas Jr. was in London, and he asked him to buy a dozen and a half busts of yellow bronze, half as big as those that were in the hall, so not as large. But who's he want? Well, whose image does he want? He wants them of Cicero, Horace, Virgil, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Pliny the Younger, Erasmus. Now it gets more interesting. Milton, Tillotson, who was an Anglican theologian, Addison, Pope, literary figures. Locke, kind of curious, because of course we associate with Locke all those words that Thomas Jefferson borrowed for the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and property becoming life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Also busts of Shakespeare and Gay, meaning John Gay, the author of The Beggar's Opera, very popular entertainment of the time. But kind of curious choice for Hutchinson because the chief character in The Beggar's Opera is a man named Macheath, who is a highwayman and was sort of satirical stand-in for Sir Robert Walpole, the great, sometimes people refer to him as the first Prime Minister of Great Britain, who gathered all sorts of, extremely corrupt, and gathered all sorts of followers in a way that Hutchinson himself was accused of doing. So interesting there. Now, about those fireplace tongs, there are a few objects that are associated with Hutchinson. It's a bit like George Washington slept here. It's lots of things are claimed, and the provenance is not always too strong. Massachusetts Historical Society owns this pair of tongs, which they say belong to Hutchinson. The buffet is, I think, a kind of corner cupboard. He uses it for the display of china, and then I think down in the bottom of the corner cupboard is this carpet that's much cut up. The little room is an interesting place. Maybe the place that Hutchinson used as his office or study. 6 walnut chairs, turkey work bottoms, walnut desk and shelves, so another secretary, a very good clock. Both clock and case broke to pieces and destroyed, he says. So, turkey work chairs, what are they? Well, here it is. Here's one. And again, this is kind of an old-fashioned style for the mid to late 18th century. So, what kind of secretary would he have had? Well, this was not obviously the one that was carried out that evening, but Hutchinson had a country house in Milton, Massachusetts, and the Patriots seized Hutchinson's house there after the battles of Lexington and Concord, and they confiscated all the property. This desk and bookcase is now now belongs to the Milton Historical Society, and I think it probably is a pretty strong Hutchinson provenance. But various cultural organizations are not to be overlooked when it comes to owning Hutchinson objects, and so Historic New England is here with this clock, to which there is a little note appended that claims, on the basis someone claimed in 1901, that was the clock that was in the house. Well, we know it was beaten to pieces, but perhaps the works were put back together and a new case made. Hard to say. Now, upstairs. This is for a modern 21st century audience. This is kind of an interesting room, the Great Chamber. I don't think anybody is actually sleeping in the Great Chamber. But it has a bed in it, and I think it's only used for the most important guests would sleep there. However, I think it's a room for more intimate entertaining than would go on in the parlor downstairs, and so it's very lavishly furnished. And remember, in terms of the value of the furnishing, it's just under what's in the parlor. So he has a japanned looking glass. We'll take a look at what that is in a moment. Rich crimson damask bed counterpane, window curtains, 8 chairs covered back and seats are the same. Outside coverings, part of the curtains, only saved. So a lot of red damask in this room. Walls, bed curtains, seat cushions. A rich India cabinet, very little used, with 3 stands of waxwork figures inside. Filigrane dressing glass, large tortoiseshell box, small boxes with brushes, another table of carved ivory, Japan square table. I think the emphasis in this room is not only on the luxury of the curtains, but also kind of the exotic nature of the furnishings. These are curious objects for Boston in the 18th century, exotic. There's the Japan. Sorry, I slipped over that one. That's this is an English country house, much grander than Hutchinson's, but it gives you an idea of that effect of the fabric on the walls and fabric on the seats of the chairs. Japanned looking glass, so this is, the ornaments are applied gesso ornaments and then coated with repeated layers of varnish. Hard to know what the India cabinet looked like. Something like this, but we should imagine open shells because it has those waxwork figures on it. Here is a waxwork figure that was worth 38 pounds. Again, remember 7 pounds for that big secretary desk, 38 pounds for this little waxwork figure. This is not Hutchinson's, but something similar from the 18th century. Hutchinson's lodging chamber, much plainer than the great chamber. Chintz bed, bureau, small table, cane chairs, Harratine easy chair, Scotch carpet. Harratine is not a deluxe fabric, it's kind of the standard fabric of the time. Here's a chair covered in Harratine and 2 fabric samples. Here's the sort of bureau he means. We would think it very fine, but it's worth only 2 pounds to him. Scotch ingrained carpet, so a less expensive alternative than the Turkey carpet, or what we'd call an Oriental rug. Hall chamber. This is probably where Sister Sanford lives. Very good looking glass, handsome case of drawers. Crimson boiled camlet bed lined with silk, 8 cane chairs. It's a fancier room than Hutchinson's own chamber. Camlet is fabrics. When he talks about boiled fabrics, they would have been boiled to cleanse them of, fabric would have been boiled to cleanse it of grease and oil, make them softer and fluffier. Camlet is originally meant camel's hair, but by this time it's probably a combination of goat's hair and silk. Here are a couple of fabric samples of camlets from the 18th century. Back chamber, not much in the back chamber. Upper entry, not much there either. Rooms not located. There's a kitchen chamber, so there's some kind of chamber near the kitchen, which is probably where the maid lived, who had the responsibility for keeping the fire going. You just see a camp bed there, small sconce. In the cellar, here's all the wine. What's he drinking? Mainly fortified wines, sherry and Madeira. He does have a little bit of claret and a little bit of brandy. Also down in the cellar are some hams and bacon hanging up that probably made a good dinner for the people out in the street. Articles not appropriated to any room. He owned a silver-hilted gilt sword, and he eventually writes to London to get that repaired. He had a gold head on top of his cane. He had a watch that was worth 6 pounds in itself. Note he also has a microscope and a telescope, which I find interesting kind of Enlightenment attributes among his possessions. Not appropriated to any room, 8 feather beds, large damask tablecloth, again, very valuable items because they're textiles. Plate, silver plate, lost and not recovered. A dozen silver-handled knives and forks. There's a case for these, a shagreen case. Sweetmeat knives and forks, we'll get to those in a moment. Silver spoons, teaspoons, a quart tankard, a stand of castors, or spice for distributing spices or salt and pepper. Handsome coffee pot, top found beat up, or as the mob termed it, stamped. So somebody stamped it, and that's a little pun on the stamp act. It's a bit of 18th century humor for you. These sweetmeat knives didn't belong to Hutchinson, but they belonged to Andrew Oliver and his brother-in-law, so they give us a good idea of what it looked like. Here's a silver coffee pot. Sad to think of it being stamped. Maybe Paul Revere was lucky enough to have it stamped outside his house, and then he could melt it down for something else, but we don't know about that. There is another, this is a teapot that has a Hutchinson association, but there's no teapot listed in the inventory we're talking about. So It could have come from the Milton House. He could have purchased it after, when he was restocking things after the riot. Hard to say. Now, this I find a very interesting slide. This is the relative cost of apparel of the house, within the house. And it's, interesting enough, it's everybody's apparel. It's not just the family's apparel, it's everyone in the house. So Hutchinson, actually Sister Sanford tops the list at 181 pounds for her attire. Hutchinson is not far behind at 159. Again, think of these in terms of the, his clothes are worth the entire contents of the parlor downstairs, and Sister Sanford's worth considerably more than the furniture in the parlor. So dress was an important sign of their status and prosperity. Note his two sons are, their clothing is considerably more modest than their father. Unfortunately, they don't separate the clothing of the two girls. So we can assume that most of this 160 pounds worth of clothing for the girls is really accounted for by Sarah, the marriageable age daughter, and that Margaret, the younger daughter, the value of her clothing is probably much closer to William Sanford's, which is only 4 pounds. Now, Rebecca Whitmore, the housekeeper, 19 pounds. Sarah Townsend, the maid, 8 pounds. Moses Vose, the coachman, just 2.7 pounds. Mark, Negro, who's probably a footman or something to do in the stables, 3 pounds. And then Mrs. Walker, the widow who lives upstairs, 11 pounds. I'll move quickly now so that we'll have time for some questions. But Hutchinson, there are a few letters in Hutchinson's correspondence to his tailor in London. Unfortunately, none of the things that he describes to the tailor end up on this inventory, but Hutchinson does talk about, in his instructions to his tailor, he says, his clothes should be rich but modest, and he says, I would not be singular. I don't want to stand out, but it should be rich but modest. So we assume Hutchinson probably wore something like this, and not something like this, which is from Colonial Williamsburg's collection and suggests some of the over-the-top vulgarity of those folks down in the Tidewater compared to good Puritan Boston. Hutchinson's apparel, he does own a banyan, which is like a house coat like this. One of the things that always comes up in this discussion of Hutchinson, and I could strangle the person who first introduced this misunderstanding into the context, but Hutchinson, all his clothes had been taken in the riot of the night before, and the night of the 26th had been very warm, and the next day there was a kind of cold front had moved through, and it was much colder. And Hutchinson has a meeting of the Superior Court, and he had made a big deal when he became Chief Justice of expecting everyone to wear gowns and robes and the wigs that judges wear in British courts still. But he has to apologize when he comes in the next day to the meeting of the Superior Court because he apologizes for his apparel. And he's wearing a camlet surtout overcoat, surtout everything. You wear it on top of everything else. It was really kind of a riding coat that he ordered, but Robert St. George imagined that as something like this, and so he has Hutchinson appearing in his pajamas and saying this is really example of effete loyalism that he'd be running around the day after the riot like this. No, he wasn't wearing his banyan, he was wearing his overcoat. when he appeared before the Superior Court. I'd show you here just a selection of waistcoats, vests from the 18th century to indicate male plumage at the time. Men's clothes in the 18th century, we were much more the equals of the ladies in show in the 18th century than we are now. What did Sister Sanford wear? She probably wore something like this. Note that Sister Sanford herself had stolen from her 233 pounds in cash, which she had just gotten back from the treasurer of Massachusetts. She had loaned the money to Massachusetts. She had a spinet or keyboard in her room. She had a gold chased or engraved watch and chain and seal worth 21 guineas. This is the one object that someone was arrested with after the riot, but because there was you can imagine the day after the riot, we don't know anything about who was responsible for this, and so there was a decision to cast a sort of general amnesty over everything. Hutchinson would be reimbursed eventually by the province and not by the king, but in exchange for that, everybody who was accused of any wrongdoing in the Stamp Act riots was given amnesty as well. So that guy got off, but that was the one thing that was found on someone after the riots. Just more examples of Sister Sanford's apparel. In the list of her apparel, she has these things called stomachers, which are basically to 18th century women's gowns, often being low cut. This is to cover that space when it's not, some evening party or appropriate to show that much a décolletage. Sister Sanford's apparel, there's just threw this slide in, she's wearing something called a capuchin. Well, what's a capuchin? It's this kind of cloak. Thomas Jr.'s apparel, the curious item here is something called spatterdashes, and here are the spatterdashes. They're gaiters for riding so your clothes don't get dirty. And Thomas Jr.'s furniture, quite a bit of furniture. He's a young merchant starting off on his own. Elisha, similar. The daughter's apparel includes a couple of very elaborate petticoats. This is what would keep you warm during those cold New England winters. Some samples of the types of textiles that might have been used. Shoes from the 18th century. Now, the housekeeper, remember her claim is modest in comparison with certainly Sister Sanford, but also grander than the maid. And so I threw this slide in to give you a kind of visual comparison between what the housekeeper would be wearing and what maybe the maid would wear. The maid, however, does have some Calamanco shoes, and brace yourself for these Calamanco shoes. Here's a sample of what Calamanco looks like. So this is a pretty jazzy item that the maid is wearing. And then I find this slide very interesting. This is Mrs. Walker. He says, a widow woman to whom I had allowed living in the house several years, and she has lost a feather bed, a large looking glass, a walnut table. It all sounds like Mrs. Walker must have been somebody at some time, and now she's sort of come down in life in order that she's just being given this room out of charity on the upper floors of the house. She has furniture, but she doesn't have much in the way of clothing. Moses Vose, the coachman, as we say, has very little. And Mark, even less. So that's a brief sketch of what was in the house and what the people were wearing, and I think I should stop there and take any questions that you might have, and then you can go off to have a nice al fresco dinner on this warm September night in the North End.
We definitely do have some time for questions, so if you're watching at home, feel free to get some questions into the stream. Emily's, I know, keeping an eye on that at the moment, so we'll be monitoring that. If anybody has questions in the room here, of course, we can toss them out. You want to get started?
Yeah.
John, how do you account for the fact that he should have had a large library, but there seems to be no record of it?
Complete mystery. Complete mystery. And he doesn't seem to order very many books to replace it. I mean, I expected to see a long list of books accompanying his letters to London. He requests other household items, but not the library. Was the rest of the library that was so famous out in Milton? It just seems unlikely that he would keep it at his country house instead of here in Boston. But it's one of the puzzles. There are a number of puzzles to the inventory, like why not more silver? Why we know nothing about the books at all, except his reputation as being someone who had lots of books.
Question I had as well, John. So just to, maybe you could speak to this a little bit. Certainly this ended up being we're even seeing this itemized, a traumatic event for them, but this wasn't the first scare that they had over the month, right, of August 65. No. So certainly not knowing the full scale of what was to happen, but was this sort of an event, losing property, a fear for the Hutchinsons, for Thomas at this moment?
Well, of course, there had been the first Stamp Act riot 12 days earlier. This riot involved Andrew Oliver, Hutchinson's brother-in-law, and a secretary of the province, had been named stamp distributor for the province of Massachusetts. So therefore, he was a particular target of the riots. And he was summoned anonymously to appear at the Liberty Tree to resign his office as stamp master, to say that he would never sell these stamps, these stamped paper that you needed to make documents truly valid. And so he was called upon to resign. He was hanged in effigy on the Liberty Tree, and then that evening the mob proceeded to the waterfront, and they destroyed a new warehouse that Oliver had been building, which people assumed was going to be the office for the distribution of this stamped paper. So they destroyed the warehouse, and then they attacked Hutchinson's house, Oliver's house. And at Oliver's house, they really just kind of threw rocks through the windows and at the door, and not that that's insignificant. It would be terrifying to be inside while people were throwing rocks through the windows. But I think he expected something like that. And on the night of the 14th, they did eventually come to Hutchinson's house, which, as you saw in that letter that I read earlier, he said he had shut up, so maybe he'd closed the shutters on the house. But his house was kind of saved by a neighbor who said, "Oh, he's off in the country, he's not there." And so on that evening, they left his house alone. And so in the 12-day interval, I'm sure, yes, they must have been worried about future attacks. But again, in the letter that I quoted, Hutchinson says he intended to stay in the house himself, so he really wasn't expecting anything like the violence. Maybe he thought that this people would throw rocks through his windows. That's kind of, I mean, it doesn't happen all the time in Boston, but remember this is there's no police force in 18th century Boston. There are just a few constables, and they're not going to disperse a mob. And so the general nature of 18th century violence might be, throwing rocks at somebody's house or chasing them down the street or something like that. But they didn't really expect anything like the destruction of Hutchinson's house. It was shocking. It was shocking to everyone, and I think even many people who were political opponents of Hutchinson were shocked by the violence of the attack and very quick to disclaim any responsibility for the attack.
Yeah.
Yep.
So obviously the account we have from Hutchinson is, he has his own
Version.
Yeah, he feels terrible, and he's going through his entire inventory. Are there any other accounts of what happened? Because that would be an overnight riot in the middle of a busy neighborhood. Does everyone just not say a thing about what happened down the street?
More or less, yeah. Yes. Even the newspaper accounts kind of minimize what has happened in these disturbances. It was. No, did you see anything? I didn't see anything. So
he's literally a lone voice in a town that everyone's like, oh.
Yeah, I think there is some sense amongst his political opponents, James Otis, who, when Hutchinson is petitioning to the general court to, the cost of the reimbursement, £2,500, was enormous. It would have been a very significant tax to lay on the city of Boston if you wanted to say the city of Boston was responsible. They quickly threw that hot potato to the general court and said, oh, well, clearly these were outsiders who came into Boston. Does any of this sound familiar? We don't know any of these rioters. There must be people from outside. We don't know anything about them. And so the town of Boston said, we're not paying for this. And general court said, we're not paying for this. And then Hutchinson sent this inventory to the Crown to ask for reimbursement. The Parliament was about to order the province of Massachusetts to reimburse the people, sufferers in the Stamp Act riot, and word got to the Massachusetts General Court that it would be better if you guys did this on your own initiative rather than a Parliament had to order you to do it. But no, we don't have many first-person accounts. Nobody was said, I was standing in there and I saw it all happen.
Yeah, it's impressive collective amnesia.
Yes, yeah. Yeah.
So no real witnesses.
No. Yes.
As word spread down the coast and other riots were held, who was targeted? Was it other governors?
Generally stamp distributors in those other places. In Newport, they actually flattened the guy's house. It was a wooden frame house, so you could do that. You just knock out the joints. And so it was generally the victims were stamp distributors, I think in all, or other people who had, I guess also in Newport there was one person who had written in defense of the Stamp Act, thought it was a legitimate exercise of authority, and he was targeted. But elsewhere in Philadelphia and Maryland and New York, it's the stamp distributor.
So I do have a question as well. This might be reading too far ahead into where things end up with Hutchinson, but I am struck by some of the simplicity of the items that we see here, but also, as you were saying, some very exotic pieces for Boston. So teasing out the entire collection here in the very deep inventory, what do you see the collection saying about Hutchinson's place in the empire at that moment? Is he trying to fit a little bit more into this cosmopolitan notion of things while still living in provincial Boston? Do you think these speak to where he's seeing his place within the imperial project at this moment in 65.
Yeah, a very interesting question. There's this concept that some historians talk about in the 18th century in the colonies of what they call Anglicization. In other words, the colonies trying to be like England in their behavior and sort of ape the manners of the gentility in Great Britain. And so the question is, how much is Hutchinson trying to join this group? And yeah, I think he certainly sees himself as part of an Anglo-American elite, but the North Americans, when they arrive in London, either as visitors or as refugees after the Revolution begins, one of the first things they do, they hardly go anywhere, they just hide in the hotel until a tailor comes and outfits them with a new suit of clothes. There were also apparently, even then, enough differences in speech that North Americans were sort of conscious about the way they spoke. So I would say Hutchinson sees himself as a member of the elite, but he's not the most fashion-conscious person. He's a little fuddy-duddy. He's not, he doesn't have to have the latest fashion. That's not his style. He wants rich but modest is the code word. And certainly he wants his clothes, his house, his possessions to indicate his prestige and status in the community and his knowledge of how things are done elsewhere. Hutchinson, one of a relatively few people, hundreds of people had made the trip to London and back in Boston, but still, it's a relatively small segment of the population. He's been there. He knows what London is like. He has a sense of it, but he's not pulling out all the stops to spend to create some sort of palace for himself. Yes.
You mentioned the house stood until the 1830s.
Yes.
Did Hutchinson return to the house?
Yes. Now. So the house, it takes about a year to put the house back together, but then he's living in the house for about 2 years, and then he was lieutenant governor, and his predecessor, Sir Francis Bernard, leaves in 1769 and goes back to England. That means Hutchinson is acting governor, and then from that point on, he's acting governor and then governor in his own right after 1771 to 1774. So from 1769 to 1774, he's living in a building called the Province House, which was the official governor's residence. And that stood, how should we describe it? Just opposite the old granary burial ground. If you walked out the gate of the old granary burial ground and down an alley, you'll come to a set of steps. That is the last remains of the Province House. But there's a lot of controversy about the Province House because Bernard had been away for a while, and the house was in disrepair. You can imagine that the General Court was not eager to spend a lot of money on the Province House, given that it was the residence of these two men that they generally disliked, Sir Francis Bernard and Thomas Hutchinson. So there's a little tug of war going on as to between whether the General Court will pay for repairs to the Province House, which apparently really needed when Hutchinson moved in, and it becomes a bit of an issue. And again, the Secretary of State for the Colonies is about to order the General Court to make these repairs when they finally do. But so he did return to the house for a while. He complains that the house was not as comfortable as his own house, but I think that means maybe drafty, imagine the Province House with windows rattling around that need to be replaced and plaster coming off the ceiling and so on. The Province House was not in great shape, but people complained. It's hard for us we think of 18th century Boston so close together. I mean, the Province House is not very far away from here. We could walk there in 15 minutes. But people complained that his own personal house on Garden Court Street was too far away from things. So he needed to move to the Province House.
Well, on that point, I think that's probably a good
Right.
point for us to stop. The house
Okay.
no longer there, of course, today, but for those of us here, you can just walk straight up the street here and see the location where it was.
There's a metal plaque on the wall.
Big metal plaque on the side. Yep. Well, everyone here and those virtually, if you could join me in thanking once again. Thank you for everybody here turning out. We really appreciate it. Thank you all for watching at home. We greatly appreciate that. Thanks to Annie and GBH for
Yes, indeed.
allowing the streaming here. Of course, a thank you to the Lowell Institute again for making this happen. Our next lecture, we're doing 2 weeks between the lectures this series. Our next lecture will be on September 28th. If you're coming in person, it will be over at Old North Church. We still have some spots available. If you want to sign up and join us in person, that will also be streaming online as well. So absolutely you can join for that one. Manuel Pires will be lecturing Who Was Prince Hall? An Introduction to an Extraordinary Man. So we're really excited to have that just next to Copp's Burial Ground where Prince Hall, of course, rests today. So again, thank you all for tuning in, turning out, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Come around here?
Yeah.
Great, thanks a lot.
Hi.
A silly question.
Oh.
All of those beautiful artifacts, you
Mhm.
described,
Yes.